Welcome to Conversations Over Coffee with Jonathan Wilson. I'm William. This is Jonathan. As an intro to kick off this podcast, a quick explanation. What we're going to do, we're going to have conversations and we're going to have coffee. How's your coffee?
Go. It's awesome. I love it.
What'd I make for you today?
You made me a flat white, my favorite.
It's very appropriate. And I just, I'm having an Americano.
Okay.
Which I think is kind of funny, but given things here. But the whole point of this is for us to have simple, short conversations, enjoying coffee together. So for those of us who, or I know you, but for those of you out there that don't know Jonathan, give us a quick little intro.
All right. Well, to give you basically a background of my life, I've got a pretty kind of varied background, diverse, I guess. I was born in Hong Kong with an English father, Spanish mother. I always say I was made in Hong Kong with English and Spanish parts. My first language was Spanish, even though obviously in Hong Kong, Spanish is not the first language, but my father spoke good Spanish. My mother, who was Spanish, spoke good English, and they made a decision to speak Spanish in the home, which I'm really thankful for, living in Southern California, where Spanish is probably spoken more than English. I'm really thankful for that, and I love the Spanish language, culture. That's very much a part of who I am. Wilson, of course, is not a very Spanish name, but the first few years of my life, my father was in the British Council, which is like the cultural side of the British embassy. And so we traveled. My sister was born in West Africa, in Ghana. We spent some time in North Africa, in Morocco, and southern Spain. And then Lebanon, we went to Lebanon, to Beirut. And they were some of my first memories. When I was 5, we went to England, and I was educated in England. I arrived in England not speaking a word of English, only Spanish. So I learned English pretty quickly because they were, school was not, the other school kids were not that kind to me.
Huh.
And I learned English, was educated in England, went to public school. I had a very privileged education. And then basically at the age of 18, kind of dropped out and traveled overland, spent 3 years traveling overland through Africa, from North Africa all the way down to South Africa, across to India, through Sri Lanka, Nepal, Southeast Asia, to Australia. And I arrived in Australia. And when I was there, after I'd been there for a year or two, I had a life-changing encounter with Jesus that changed the whole trajectory of my life. And that's when I became a Christian. And out of that, I knew straight away, when I first accepted Christ as my Savior, I found my purpose and my call. I'd always wondered, what am I going to do with my life? I knew that I loved people. I loved working with people. But I just didn't know what it was. But when I accepted Christ, I knew straight away I had that sense of the call of God on my life. So I started serving in a church, started growing in my faith, studying, and then ended up going into the ministry after some years of volunteering in the church. And then was a part of a big church, had a lot of responsibility there. And then 15 years ago, God spoke to us about coming to Southern California, planting a church here. And we came here 15 years ago and planted a church in the Newport area in Orange County and called it Newport Church. And so here we are 15 years later. That's kind of a synopsis of my life.
And thankful that you're here now too. So
yeah. So let me ask you a question.
All right, I'm ready.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, William.
I did not do extensive overland traveling, but I'm the son of 2 great parents, a husband to my wife Jana. I have 2 great sons. I am, as a day job, I'm an architect. You know that, but For those of you, I'm an architect. I love the creative world, anything and everything creative. I like to get my hands in on it and study it, look at it, be a part of the creation. That's what really drives me. So
Awesome.
That's why I like this. I think it's going to be a creative adventure that
Yep,
we're on here.
Definitely.
So a little background to why we're doing a podcast. There's those of us in your world who you do life with, who day to day, whether it's the team here at Newport Church, it's your friends, it's your small group. We've been talking, and we just decided there's got to be more ways that we get more Jonathan. And so we thought it would be great to have this other format where it's similar to interactions we have with you, that is not the Sunday teaching.
Right.
We have the podcast, Newport Church podcast, where we get that, and that's broadcast. So which is fantastic. But there's much more that we want to get out of you. So we've put together this format to have conversations with you, hopefully to have unique insights and the depth that you have from especially your story. That I think a lot of us love to hear kind of the extractions from your story that play a part in the wide range of topics that we talk about day in and day out. So we're going to explore some topics, but as we were preparing for this, we really wanted to zero in on focusing on these conversations. We talked about being organic.
Yep.
We wanted them to be authentic. And we want them to be purposeful.
Yep.
So the idea is not that they're scripted, but they do have that intentionality behind them.
Right.
So that they're more than the just simple chit chat kind of thing.
Right. Excellent.
And then hopefully along the way, we're gonna drink some great coffee, right? And hopefully also with a range of topics, we're going to explore some different coffee beans as well.
Good. I love that.
Which I think will be fun. So in our initial talks about this, we started to dive into the ideas behind talking and having conversation.
Yeah.
What do you see as the differences in that?
Well, that's a great question, because I think there's a big difference between talking and conversation. I think all of us know what it's like to be talked at or talked to.
Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
Yeah, totally. Or talked about even.
Yeah.
And talking is something that we all do. But conversation is something that takes us deeper. Conversation is something that we engage with another person in a conversation that takes us into deeper thought. And actually, the dictionary definition of conversation is a interaction or a talk between two people where they communicate and express ideas and thoughts. Yep. So the idea of conversation is we're going deeper into any particular subject. And I think we live in a world where the art of conversation maybe has been lost. We try to abbreviate everything. We have acronyms for everything. We have numbers for everything. We try to we use emojis or emojis, whichever way you describe it, on our Instagram or our text messages, and so the art of conversation to a large degree is not being lost, but we're not using it as much as we used to. And I went to boarding school, and maybe we'll talk about that later, explain some of my strange behavior in England. And but my father was a great conversationalist, and he would have long conversations with me, sometimes so long that my mind would go somewhere else. But he stimulated that idea of conversation and the power of conversation, the power of thinking, not just on the surface. When a lot of talking is surface, shallow, but about going deeply into a particular subject, and that stirred something in me. And I've always been a conversationalist. My father told me, I didn't grow up in a church family, and he told me, he said, "You're either going to be a politician or a preacher." So conversation was something that was really important. And it's interesting that the word converse, to converse, we're conversing, but the word converse also means opposite. So in a conversation, in a sense, we're hearing maybe a different perspective.
Oh, okay.
We're hearing a different point of view.
Yep.
The converse of on is off. The converse of black is white. So we're looking at the whole. I think I love conversation because it brings different perspectives. It brings different views. So that's really why I love conversation, and I find it stimulating. Yeah. I actually find it energizing. Some people don't, but I do.
And I think when I try to have intentional conversations, when my mind is really intentional about it, I hope to hear things that are different than what I was already thinking. Yeah. I want my brain to be stimulated. Yeah. I want my heart to be stimulated. And sometimes it has to be stimulated in a way that is just a total reverse of my thinking, or just a different take on it. Because that's where I walk away from that conversation feeling like there was huge value in it. And that's what I get excited about when I think of those good conversations that I have.
Yeah, totally. I think one thing I wanted to mention was I think when I think about it, some of the most significant moments in my life have come out of conversations. So, for example, when I accepted Christ as my Savior, when I came to faith in Christ, it came out of several conversations. Conversations that were difficult for me because it made me ask questions. Yeah. It made me ask questions about myself, about my perspective on God, about my perspective on life. And those conversations were actually initially very uncomfortable, but they were very profitable because they led me to a place where I had an encounter with Christ that totally transformed my life. And I think even what we're doing now, I mean, you know as well as I do, I'm not the first person that wants to jump on any media platform and do some kind of podcast because I think people need to hear what I've got to say. I'm kind of much more reluctant, and you guys have kind of pulled me into this. But it's come out of a conversation where we've talked about it, and I've thought about it, and I've thought, okay, let's do something that's a little different, a little creative, and I'm hoping that it's going to stimulate that in other people and help people to come out with some creative ways of not only having conversations, but creative things that will come out of those conversations.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so let's transition to coffee.
Okay.
When I want to meet up with a friend, when I want to catch up with them, I just first think of coffee. And I usually try to convince that other person to come join me downtown at my favorite coffee shop. I love the creativity in coffee and coffee making, all the ins and outs of the beans, the roasting, the espresso machine, the milk, on and on and on. But when we were preparing for this, we started to talk about a little bit about the history of coffee.
Right.
And that started to really intrigue me and just make this much more purposeful to me when we started linking conversation and coffee together and its historical kind of precedent.
Yeah.
Like you do a much better job of the storytelling and walking me through. What are some of the things that stood out to you when we were doing this little deep dive into the coffee side?
And conversation? Yeah. Well, I love history. And I'm intrigued by history. And if you study the history of coffee beans were first discovered, if you like, in Ethiopia, were then taken to Yemen, and then began to be drunk as a drink. And it was basically spread throughout the Islamic world through the Ottoman Empire in the 17th, I think it was the 16th century. And the 16th century, the first coffee house opened in Istanbul. Of course, Turkish coffee is famous. And they began to drink coffee. And coffee was a place where people would go and they would have conversations. They would discuss, and they would actually play games, and they would discuss and have meaningful conversations.
Yeah.
And from there, coffee spread into the rest of of Europe and the rest of the Christian world. We can, maybe we'll touch on this in the future, but it's very funny how initially coffee was viewed in Western Europe as the devil's drink. It was black and dark, and it was greeted with suspicion, and then it became more and more accepted, and people began to love coffee, and coffee houses started all over Europe. And they became places, unlike taverns where people went to drink alcohol, coffee shops were associated with meaningful conversation, exchanging of ideas, conversations, and many of the great scientists. Isaac Newton would go to coffee shops in London, and Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels, many of the great authors and writers and artists and poets and scientists would all go to coffee shops, and they would exchange ideas. And so it became a place where ideas were exchanged, and coffee and conversation kind of went hand in hand. Yeah. It was like the two went together, like bread and butter. And, and it was even today, I discovered recently in the University of Boston, every week, all of the faculty, all of the staff, and all the students gather together for what they call coffee and conversation, where they discuss modern, current topics, and they exchange ideas. So the two, coffee and conversation, just go together. And that's why I think this is, I love the concept or idea of us having meaningful, deeper discussions and conversation over coffee. Yeah,
and one of the things that stuck out to me when we were looking at it was the whole idea of it in a coffee house. It kind of breaks down a lot of the social barriers, where you're at, in your wealth, where you are in your education, your job. Like it's a place where all of those different stratas of people are coming together.
Yeah.
And you can, money wasn't a barrier. Usually they're on a public street. You just walk in and go in. Yeah. And so it really is a gathering place.
Yeah.
I think that can gather people of different backgrounds.
Totally. Well, the interesting thing, I grew up, when I lived in England, I lived 15 miles from Oxford. So if anyone asks where I was from in England, I'll say 15 miles from Oxford, because everyone knows about Oxford. But in Oxford, I think it was the 17th century, they used to call coffee houses penny universities. And the reason they called it that was because you could buy a coffee for a penny, and you could go to a coffee shop, anybody could go, and you could walk in there and you could listen to these amazing conversations about some of the greatest intellectual minds and some of the most innovative thinkers and creative people on the planet would be discussing ideas and who were at the forefront of their field, and people could just come and sit in and listen to those conversations. So a person could walk off the street without any kind of education or background, and they could sit there and listen to some of the great educators and thinkers of the day. So that concept of the penny university, this is an exchange of ideas and thoughts. I love that. And it was an equalizer, because in those days, society in England was very hierarchical. So coffee actually became an equalizer. And I kind of love that concept when we're talking about coffee and conversation, the idea that our faith is a great equalizer. It brings us all together. We're all in this together. Yeah, we're all the same. We all have the same creator.
Yeah, but not thinking that this is going to go down a kumbaya road of we're all together, because coffee and conversation also has a historical precedent of sparking revolutionary ideas. Being kind of an avenue or a setting to really create challenging ideas. in what we're.
Yeah, totally. It's fascinating when you look at the history of coffee, because what came out of these intellectual discussions was that these became forums for revolutionary ideas.
Yeah.
And if you look at what happened, for example, in France, in Paris, they had to ban coffee shops because coffee shops became places where the revolutionary ideas that were the seedbed of the French Revolution were really discussed and birthed.
That's so weird to think about. Like, you think about the coffee shop down the street, or
Yeah.
the one by your house, or wherever it is, and you're like, that place has to all of a sudden become banned.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, it's an amazing thing, because that literally was happening all over the world. So in England, during the similar time, Charles I was the first king who was executed. He was beheaded, and his son Charles II eventually came to the throne. And during his time, these coffee shops were just exploding, and in these coffee shops they were having what he viewed as subversive conversations, and so he tried to shut down the coffee shops and ban coffee shops. So he banned coffee shops, and it lasted 11 days because the outcry was so great that he was forced to open them again. And then in the US, America's love affair with coffee began with the Boston Tea Party.
Had to have.
When some patriots dressed up got on board a ship, and they threw 3 shiploads of tea owned by the British East India Company. They threw it overboard, and basically at that time, tea was off the menu in America.
Out.
In fact, John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, loved tea so much that he said, I have to be weaned off tea. Tea must be removed.
No longer patriotic.
No longer be drunk. So yes, it was a seedbed. It was a place where revolutionary ideas were discussed. And I think in the sense of our conversation, my hope is that, what is a revolutionary idea? A revolutionary idea is one that causes you to think a different way. Jesus was the greatest revolutionary who ever lived. Yeah. What he communicated was totally revolutionary to his day.
Yeah.
And it turned his world upside down. It turned our world upside down. The very nature of the world in which we live was shaped by the revolutionary ideas that Jesus introduced. And so my hope is that in our discussion, that maybe there's a thought. It doesn't have to be the whole conversation, but one thought or one thing that's said that will be a creative spark, that'll spark something in someone's thinking, maybe see something from a different perspective that in a sense will be revolutionary. Just like that day I had a conversation with someone who told me I could be born again.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you mean born again? What does that mean? And that was one of the most significant questions I ever asked, because the conversation that followed was so revolutionary. It totally transformed and revolutionized my life. So maybe a thought, a question, an idea that could be sparked would be, I think, is what I hope for out of these conversations over great coffee.
Same here. When I think of those great conversations that I've had in my life to this date, I think of they don't just end. Yeah. And that's what we hope here is we hope to spark thoughts in each other, and also, but the reason of broadcasting is to hopefully spark ideas in other people as well, so that when they go the next day, later in the afternoon, to have a conversation with a friend, hopefully over coffee, that conversation can continue, and it can spark other ideas. It can create other ideas, thoughts, moments that impact people's lives.
Yeah.
I think that's what's exciting. That's what we're hoping for. And so we may not work out all of the ideas. It's not necessarily a complete thought that we're after
Right.
here. Just to wrap up, hopefully what we can do here is pretty frequent. We're going to start off with hopefully something every couple weeks, every month, to start out and have a really good progress of discussions, conversations over coffee. Thank you for joining us on this first episode of Conversations Over Coffee with Jonathan Wilson. We got more coming soon. So please subscribe to the podcast. Share on social media as we send stuff out. We'd love for you to continue to be a part of our conversations.